On the 4th of July, get ready for Free Friday Frisbee fireworks in Chicago. The reigning UFA champion Minnesota Wind Chill and the undefeated Chicago Union set for an absolutely massive Week 11 liftoff. Opening poll set for 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 o'clock Central, and broadcast for free on UFA YouTube. So tune in as the top two teams in the Central Division both seek a statement result to start the holiday weekend on Friday Night Frisbee, presented by Pabst Light.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Evan Lepler. We have 8 playoff spots clinched with 3 weekends remaining in the 2025 UFA regular season, which is to say we know a lot, but we also don't know that much, Evan. Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Colorado, Madison, Minnesota, Oakland, and Salt Lake have all punched their ticket to the postseason, but with no seeds confirmed yet, really everything is still up in the air given how much parity has been on display in 2025, how many crazy results we've had, and how many important matchups there are forthcoming. You know, we've got this fourth Friday Frisbee sort of fanatic event, I think, going on in just 2 days. We've got the top of the Central Division matching up on Friday Night Frisbee at 5 p.m. Eastern between Minnesota and Chicago. That will be on UFA YouTube. Then we've got a Toronto at Montreal matchup, which, while not necessarily having an important impact on the playoff picture, is certain to be a really contentious rivalry game that I think will just have an elevated status on the holiday, even if our Canadian brethren aren't necessarily celebrating U.S. independence alongside of us. But then in the nightcap, the top 2 teams in the West Division, Colorado, Salt Lake. Honestly, outside of DC, New York, probably my pick for like most contentious and hottest rivalry we've had over the last 3 seasons. Every single time those 2 teams match up, it just feels like they've got something to prove. The last time they met was Alex Atkins capping it with an interception in the end zone and then triple spiking it in front of Matt Russnagel's disapproval. There's a lot going on going into Week 11. Where does your head kind of sit as we work towards this home stretch and what feels like the best Frisbee of the year so far?
Yeah, well, we're not going to see any triple spikes from Alex Atkins after scoring a goal because unfortunately he's hurt. Now, I
Yeah.
wouldn't put it past him to take the disc from Zeke Thorison after, Zeke catches a Tobias Brooks huck and then spiking it 3 times on the sideline to get the fans fired up. That seems on brand for Atkins. But yeah, Adam, I'm really excited for this weekend. If football has Thanksgiving and basketball has a quintuple header every Christmas, like a triple header on the 4th of July with a 5 o'clock Eastern game featuring the top 2 teams in the Central, 2 championship contenders, the reigning champs versus the undefeated team in Minnesota, Chicago. Then you got the Canadian rivalry game in the middle, right around dinner time on the East Coast, and then 9 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Mountain, the top 2 teams in the West. And you're absolutely right. That rivalry is excellent. Every game of theirs is interesting. It's never over till it's over. And these games are super duper meaningful, right? Like, we have 8 playoff teams. Interestingly, only one of the 8 playoff teams, unless I'm mistaken, but only one of the 8 playoff teams that has clinched already did not make the playoffs last year, and that would be the Colorado Summit, who struggled against an interdivisional slate last year and had a little bit of a softer schedule this year. They still lost their 2 interdivisional games down in Texas, but a couple overtime wins for the Summit this past weekend. I still am really curious what exactly this Colorado team is. Like, if you listen to this podcast in the preseason, they were kind of my preseason pick to win the West. Then they go and lose to Houston and Austin and have just kind of been relatively unimpressive at times. And, time for them to put their chips on the table because the next 2 Friday nights they've got the Shred at home in Golden this weekend and then at Salt Lake, Friday Night Frisbee. But, yeah, I mean, triple header on 4th of July, free Friday Frisbee, and fireworks. It's going to be a great weekend. And, my big picture thought as we head into the final 3 weeks of the season is it's still astonishingly wide open, like from a
Mm-hmm.
championship race perspective. Because, like, yeah, we don't know who the one seed is going to be in most divisions, and that information will start to, be less cloudy in the weeks ahead with all the key games that are coming up. But, like, regardless of who the one seeds are, it feels like there are still 10 teams that could win the championship, which is just incredible at this stage of the year. Like, you can envision teams peaking at the right time and putting it all together. And, maybe we get chalk and maybe we get chaos. And based upon the season we've had, I kind of have an inkling we might have some postseason chaos. But yeah, just really excited for the weekend that's ahead, and not to mention DC Boston on Sunday, which it's
Oh
an
yeah.
it's a nice game for Boston, but it's a season defining potentially game for DC. If they can go on the road and get that win and stay above the fray in that pack, with Philly and New York in the East. The other thought is like, 3 weeks left in the season, and there are two teams that are currently in fourth place right now that I think if they get into the playoffs, you got to take them seriously as championship contenders. But I'm talking about New York in the East and Carolina in the South. And as we stand right now, those teams are in fourth place. They are not in the tournament, which, is crazy because if those teams get there and can put the momentum together, you got to take them seriously, right? They have all the experience, but that just speaks to the depth of the league and how interesting the home stretch is actually going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely concur with you about New York and Carolina. I mean, you've got the two undefeated remaining teams in Boston and Chicago with the longest winning streaks in the league. Then you've got Salt Lake riding the 7 game hot streak. And then behind them, you've got two teams with 5 game winning streaks, the reigning champion Minnesota Wind Chill and the Carolina Flyers, who have climbed fully out of the grave and, to your point, look like one of the best teams in the league right now. I mean, they have ostensibly the best player in Alan Laviolette. They have all-world receiver in Jacob Fairfax, who's the living definition of he's down there somewhere, right? I mean, you just, 30, 40% of the world is covered by land. The rest of it is Fairfax. I mean, you mentioned it on the broadcast, and it's one of those things that I've continually thought of since you've kind of been bringing it up the past couple of seasons. He's one of those players who every single year just falls into a category of we can't quite nominate him as like an MVP or maybe even like an offensive player of the year, but in terms of just value of what he brings for this Flyers organization, he became the 8th member ever to reach 300 goals this past weekend too. Shout out for that career milestone, but just what he brings in terms of like the confidence that offense plays with. I know Austin was reeling after just a weird night in Atlanta on Friday night with the torrential downpour and everything last Saturday,
Whew.
but Carolina just continued to stretch them deep at their will. And a lot of that was just Jacob Fairfax absolutely dominating whoever the soul threw on him. And so, yeah, you have this Carolina team that has all the weapons in the world, has the confidence of having been to the postseason 9 straight seasons. This year would make it number 10. And if they make it in, they're the number 1 team. And everyone else in the South has been saying it that people don't want to face. The thing is that they still have work to do. They don't entirely control their own destiny with the San Diego Growlers sitting slightly above them in 3rd place in the South Division standings at 6-4. And with the Growlers having that double overtime win against the Flyers a few weeks ago, they own a head-to-head tiebreaker, which is just bad news bears for these Flyers.
So here's an interesting thing is that Carolina is currently in fourth place, but as I understand it, they do control their destiny because they're tied in the loss column right now. So if both
Uh-huh.
San Diego and Carolina win the rest of their games, well, yeah, no, they do control their own destiny because if they beat Atlanta, and then obviously have to beat Austin and Houston too. They'd be 8-4, and the best Atlanta can be in that scenario is 8-4, and that creates a three-way tie if San Diego wins their last two games against LA and Oakland, and the Spiders on the road after what the Spiders did to the
Oof.
Growlers in San
Now we're
Diego.
really getting
Certainly,
into devil's math.
it seems like a tough but just to make it clear, the Flyers from 0 and 4 still control their destiny, even though they're on the outside looking in right now. And
And they don't
the
own the
math,
head-to-head matchup against the Growlers that are technically ahead of them in the standings. That's just how crazy the season has been. Right?
yeah, I mean that. So if Carolina finishes in a three-way tie with Atlanta and San Diego, the Flyers are in. But let's just say Atlanta beats Carolina, and Carolina goes to Texas and sweeps, and Carolina finishes 7-5. If San Diego also finishes 7-5 and it's just a two-way tie, then it's the Flyers who are out because of that one-on-one head-to-head. So yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
no. We were planning on jumping into the different divisional races, like the Austin Soul. We haven't even mentioned them yet. They're still in first place, even though they lost twice this past weekend, and they control their own destiny to be the one seed. But they need to take care of business at Houston. They've never lost to the Havoc, but it's a rivalry game. It would make Houston's season if they were able to win this one on Saturday against the Soul. Austin also has to do with LA at home. Austin's certainly a heavy favorite, but the Aviators have been pesky. And then the big one is the final Friday night of the regular season when Carolina goes to Austin. And, if the Flyers have beaten Atlanta the previous weekend, then that Carolina Austin game, which is a big if, by the way, because Atlanta is still Atlanta, and I still think we have to take them as seriously as anybody in the league, regardless of the record. But I'm
Right.
looking at that Carolina Austin game on Friday, July 18th, and thinking like that's very well could be Austin's like last stand. You know, the irony, though, is if Carolina beats Atlanta, and let's assume, what happens when you assume, but let's for the moment, if Austin handles their stuff against Houston and LA, then Austin could still lose that game to Carolina and still be the one seed. So that might not be a meaningful game, but yeah, that's why the South Division race. I mean, you could argue it's even more
All right.
interesting than the
All
East
right.
right now because of all the different permutations. You got all that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I was writing it down. Trust me on this. Just so I think we got derailed completely from what I was trying to establish is just the general playoff picture across these divisions, right? So maybe let's just start at the top. Let's go in the Central. The three spots are already locked up with Chicago, Minnesota, and Madison in that descending order. The seeds have not been established. If Chicago wins this Friday against Minnesota, do they just need to win that game to clinch the one seed in the Central? I believe so, correct?
Mathematically,
Math.
no. I mean,
No, because Madison
they
could still potentially tie them with a win over them in like the final weekend of the regular season.
no. And this will just be Minnesota's second loss, right? Chicago would be 9-3 if
Right.
Chicago would be 9-0 if they lost their. But for all intents and purposes, if Chicago wins this game or loses by 4 or fewer,
Okay.
Chicago's the one
We
seed.
can't do the math again. We can't do the math for each of these divisions. I just want to get through them. Central Division, Chicago,
You
Minnesota, Madison.
you asked me.
Those three spots are currently clinched in the Central, but the seedings are yet to be determined. In the East Division, you've got Boston with the clinched playoff spot. Outside of that, four teams still vying for three spots. Philadelphia, DC, and New York in that order, still vying for the second and third seed in the East Division. In the South, as we were just talking about a moment ago, you still have Austin in the top spot at 7-2. Right behind them is Atlanta at 8-3, and then you've got the Growlers at 6-4, with the Flyers at 5-4, right on their heels. And then last but not least, the West Division, 7-1 Salt Lake, 6-2 Colorado, and 8-3 Oakland. All three of those teams have clinched playoff spots, but seeding, much like the Central, is yet to be determined. Okay. I just wanted to get through that so we have a map to look at as we move forward.
Would you like me to go through the adjusted point differential for each team and how? No, I'm just kidding.
I
Um,
would, but I don't know if
hope
our audience would, Evan, to be quite honest. But,
our
it just,
audience is pretty hardcore.
they are. But that's real wonk math, I feel like, getting into all the playoff permutations. I know that's something you adore deeply, but I feel like in lieu of all these games upcoming, especially on the 4th, we've got to get into some of these matchups. I mean, do you want to just kind of start with the
Yeah,
upcoming Minnesota Chicago game? Do you want to kind of branch from last weekend's West Division results with Salt Lake getting their second win against Oakland, with Colorado persevering on the road, but with some kind of heart palpitating finishes, for the Summit? Very yes, no, yes, no, yes kind of results for the Summit on the road once again. Where
yeah.
where would you like to start?
Well, I mean, yeah, that last point of regulation in the Colorado Oregon game, I mean, had to give Tim Kafalis a minor heart attack. Just it was a disaster. But that's not where I really want to start. I mean, I think we should start with Chicago, Minnesota, which is the marquee game. The reigning champs versus the undefeated Union in Chicago on Independence Day, and both these teams are going to be pretty darn close to full strength. Chicago is going to be without Xavier Payne, who
Pretty
has
big.
been a force, but I think they probably have like 19 of their top 20 if they were going to create a hierarchy. And
Sure.
yes, they don't have Xavier Payne to play handler defense and to shepherd things after a turn, but they still have Pavlianis, who's thrown more assists than anyone in the history of the league, to help lead the D line. Not to mention a guy like Victor Luo, who has been a starting center O line handler for the Madison Radicals in the past. So I like. I think they'll miss Xavier, but I think they have the guys to fill that gap. I'm just really interested in what this game is going to look like because I am expecting it to be completely different from the first meeting between these two teams, which was the Union's first game of the year. So Minnesota had no idea what to expect from a lineup standpoint, from a stylistic standpoint. The conditions were also brutal, and Minnesota fell behind, got in their own heads, looked awful. Like it is a different Minnesota team in almost every way mentally that'll be going to Chicago. And there's also the fact that Minnesota has quite a bit of experience winning in Chicago in recent years. And they haven't lost on the road in basically 2 full years. And Minnesota knows how critical this game is. And I just expect them to come out playing hot. Uh, and I wonder if that's going to be enough because Chicago is a really deep, talented team. But I think, pretty definitively, I think even the Chicago folks would say this like, they know that Minnesota has better chemistry and better continuity than they do. The question is, does that matter, right? Like, how much does all of Minnesota's game planning and years of institutional memory and
Well,
their
I
championship DNA get them over the hump against Chicago's talent?
I think that there's a little bit more than that kind of intangible level stuff going on too. I mean, I think, these are two of the top defenses, and when you really drill down into it, what makes Minnesota such a force are their pullers. You talk about Cameron Lacey, Sam Berglund, who's come back from injury this year, and they add in James Pollard. They just got a lot of different ways to put themselves at a situational and field advantage starting off almost any defensive possession. And I think you see almost a sort of copying and pasting of that for the Union. I mean, they've been doing similar stuff for the past few years, but I think especially this year, you see more of a focus on kind of triangulating where they can really pin opposing offenses with their pulls. I mean, you've seen Pavel Giannis pulling for essentially like the first time in his career. I'm pretty sure he's done it a couple of times previously, but this year with more of a focus on D-line rotations and lineup insertions, he started pulling as well. And I think you just see both of these teams kind of evolving into what I think will be this next era of defensive focus in the league, which is how do you kind of stunt teams at the point of attack? How do you set them up a couple yards deep in the end zone so that they have to navigate out of essentially, piranha filled waters with their first couple of throws? I know Minnesota loves to kind of set up opposing offenses essentially like on a plank. That's what they did so well against Atlanta. They make them have to navigate across field to get out of their defensive scheming, and that's just that lateral movement is so quirky, I think, for a lot of teams, and it makes them very unconfident. And I think Minnesota just does such a good job of taking advantage of that. And so I think you're going to see two defenses once again at their prime. And I agree with you. I don't think it's going to be the same 16 to what was it, 11 struggle that it was at the beginning of the season. I don't think it'll be
Yeah.
quite that low scoring. But I do think you're going to see each of these defenses kind of stymieing each other once the game gets going. I think it might be a little bit of that like kind of fast start that we have in some of these games where both teams are playing with high energy. They're both just kind of trading scores back and forth. You might get to 6-5 by like the 5-minute mark of the first quarter. I feel like we get that a lot in the UFA, and then it's just going to like slow down in the last three plus quarters. But I'm really interested to see kind of that, again, going back to the beginning of my thought, the pulling matchup. Which of these teams can kind of win the field position battle?
So, I mean, I think Minnesota has the better pullers and the better scheme and the better consistency in that regard. The problem was in the first meeting, they had many, many fewer pulls than Chicago. So,
Oh,
getting
yeah.
their pullers on the field is the first part of this. And to do that, they have to hold. And to hold, they need Will Brandt and Josh Klain and Gordon Larson and Matt Rader and Brian Vinoka and others to win matchups, to make plays, and to not succumb to the Chicago pressure uh, because the Union have been pretty suffocating. Now, the flip side of this is, Chicago played their first two games of the season in Minnesota in pretty miserable conditions, and it wasn't like they dominated, but it was an ugly game. And then that Atlanta game, you know, I didn't leave that game thinking Chicago was a buzzsaw by any means.
No,
Like they
no.
couldn't get the disc off the sideline against a double team. So
Mm-hmm.
and since then, Chicago's score lines have been impressive, but have they really impressed you in terms of beating anybody substantial? I think the answer pretty clearly is no. Even with all due respect to the Radicals, who played them pretty tough for the first half, Chicago pulled away down the stretch, and that was an interesting game. But like Chicago's going to have to raise its level from the Detroit and Indies of the league to play this Minnesota team on both sides of the disc. And Chicago's been practicing against each other, and that's good tests. The other interesting thing about the Chicago team, Adam, and I asked Charlie First, the co-head coach, today when I talked to him about this, like you want to try to establish a team identity, and you're playing this season. They've played 8 games. They only have 7 guys on their team who have played more than 5 games. Like, think about that. There's no one on the team that's played all 8. Like, 6 guys have played 7, and one other has played 6. So, like, yes, they're deep. They're 10 to 30 can beat handily the bottom teams in the Central, but they haven't had a ton of reps with their top 20 playing together, and especially against a good team. And,
Yeah, and
they didn't have Don DeMarais against Atlanta. Uh, they didn't have Nate Goff when they went to Minnesota. So, like, I'm still, I think, yeah, I'm getting to the point where I still am curious what this Chicago team looks like at full strength against a really good opponent. And that's really what I'm most excited to see on Friday afternoon.
yeah, and I think to your point, the number that bears it out the most is their turnover per game number. They're middle of the pack, and I know that they're going to say that they've had games along the lakeshore there at their new Northwestern field Madison Sports Complex venue, which does have, I think, a big wind condition to it. But for this supposedly being a juggernaut, I don't think they should rank 14th, 15th in the league in mistakes per game. And to your point, I think a lot of that has to do with lineup consistency. I think there are ways in which you can take advantage of this Union team. To your point about the matchup against Atlanta, and I think that specifically an opponent like Minnesota, which is just laser focused on this game. By the way, I mean, they sustained that loss earlier in the year. They've won every game since, 5 in a row, and you better believe this has been circled on their calendar since the schedule dropped back at the beginning of the year. And I
Yeah.
just think that it's going to be a really hard matchup for the Union to kind of manage everything, especially, we talk about that game against Atlanta. Minnesota already softened them up the night before, and it took 2 overtimes for the Union to close out the hustle. And so this will kind of be, I think, the first time we see a team just get to square off against the Union with championship aspirations. And it'll be a fantastic test for the Union. They have all the talent in the world. I concur with you. I mean, there's no doubting what lies on paper for the Chicago team. It's just whether or not in these last, 5-6 weeks of play that they can actually seal the deal. This is the real put your money where your mouth is time. And they've been writing checks, boy. They've been talking this up. This has been their goal. And so they better start, kind of proving it against a Minnesota team that's going to want to take them down. Like, right? These are the reigning champs. And Chicago has come into this season with every asterisk available for the wind chill. And I just think that this kind of sets up to be, the game of the season.
Two quick points to make. Number one, it is going to be hot. HOT, all caps. The hottest day in the next week in Chicago is Saturday. It's going to be mid 90s. It's going to be sunny. Both teams are going to have to deal with that. And the second point is this: regardless of who wins this Friday night Frisbee game in the afternoon, these two teams are going to see each other again in a more important situation with the Central Division on the line, a month from now. And
But this game
I
determines
I
who hosts that, which is of all importance.
I hear you, and I also think we could be living in a world where each has won on the other's home field this year, and we've seen that happen in the past. So I'm not saying you don't want home
True.
field. I
It's
talked to
happened
Ben
like
Feldman about this today. Like, if they're up by 3 or 4 with a few minutes to go, they're not just milking time to milk the lead. They're going to try to make it a 5 or 6 point game to try to get that extra break because they understand the point diff. So like that's the game within the game that's going on here. And you and I both know we've been around this long enough. Win or lose, both teams are going to project, rationalize, and declare they have utmost confidence in their team if they can just tighten things up, tighten the screws, and be ready for the playoffs. Like that's going to be the big one. But
an important lesson learned,
I,
right? Like whoever loses this, that was the lesson we needed to learn.
Yes, but I mean, both these teams love getting tested. I think they appreciate and respect each other, even though Chicago's been a little chesty with some of their comments. I do think, they'd much rather play Minnesota 10 times than win by 18 over Detroit every week.
Oh yeah.
So this is a really, really fun game. Both teams are fired up for it. And, I can't wait to call it. Can't wait to get to Chicago. I haven't been to Chicago for a UFA game in a couple of years now, and looking forward to spending the weekend in the Windy City for 4th of July and hopefully seeing some fireworks both on and off the field. And, this is just the start of the Friday triple header. Do you have a last point or two I mean, who do you think's going to win the game? Let's just wrap it up directly there. Who do you like to win the game? Win Chill or Union?
I like Minnesota to win this game. I just don't have any idea what that means going forward. To your point about each of these teams liking to win in each other's venues, it just feels like there's so much other kinds of dynamics that happen between the wind chill and the union that outside of this Friday, I have no certainty as to what, this matchup will mean going forward. But for Friday, I've got the wind chill. I just feel like they've got a
What?
whole bunch of momentum. It's kind of the pressure is on to Chicago to kind of prove themselves. And I just feel like this is going to be a little bit of a gut check for the undefeated team. And I could
Yeah,
totally also
and
see,
win or
Don
lose,
DeMarais taking over and Chicago winning by 4.
yeah. I mean, I kind of feel the same way. Like I'm leaning toward Minnesota, but I also think I think Chicago could just completely wear out the Minnesota offense and like win by 6 or 7, and then I'm like, how the heck did I pick Minnesota? Um, But I do lean toward Minnesota. Maybe it's just wishful thinking and wanting the narrative to for the Central Division race to keep going. Because while I don't think Minnesota or Chicago will lose any other divisional games, they each have Madison once more. Chicago gets Madison on the road, and Chicago does have to go to Pittsburgh the day after this Minnesota game. We talked about that game all the way back in like March, and I think I declared that Pittsburgh was going to win it, um, even though Pittsburgh's coming off a victory that snapped their 7 game losing streak. I don't know if I feel the same way, but it's a much weaker Chicago team that'll be traveling to the Steel City on Saturday. So who knows? Been a crazy season. Things can happen, but yeah, it's Minnesota has to go to Detroit on Saturday too. By the way, so let's not discount that. Um,
We can. We can. It's a holiday weekend. Why don't we take half off of that one? We can
I
discount
mean, the
that one.
Mechanics have only lost 2 in a row. It's not like they've lost 80 in a row. So,
This is true.
um, all right, Salt Lake and Colorado. These two teams, in so many ways, seem to bring out the best of each other. They both bring the fire. They both feel that they have the superior squad. Both teams have youth and experience and,
Speed,
you know, young,
athleticism.
young college studs like Nate DeMorgan from Carleton is playing for Salt Lake, Tobias Brooks and Zeke Thorson. And how good has Elliot Hawkins been the
Ooh.
past couple of weeks for the Summit? Um, yeah, I mean, this has a very similar feel to the Minnesota Chicago game in that, one team is a game up on the other in the standings. The difference here is that Salt Lake and Colorado haven't played yet this year. So this is kind of the opening salvo, and then they'll turn around 7 days later and play each other again. I don't. I still don't really know what to think about this Colorado team. Like the one game that Tobias Brooks played, it was a revelation, and we knew he was really good. He was in the championship game with Carolina last year, but it was one of the greatest single individual games that we've seen in the league this side of what Walker Frankenberg did in a loss to the Shred this past week, or what Alan Laviolette seems to do every time he takes the field these days. But I also feel like Salt Lake. I mean, am I crazy to say that Salt Lake deserves to be considered like a slight favorite, or maybe this game's a pick 'em? Because the way Salt Lake has handled its business and gotten better in the second half of games, and just like every week seems to add a new athlete into the lineup that makes plays, man, I mean, the Shred have been the more consistent high level team over the last month compared to Colorado. But Colorado's getting reinforcements and they're at home. So I'm about as wishy washy as I can be in terms of breaking this game down, and I will pass the baton to you to save me.
I mean, there's just a lot of napalm in this matchup. I mean, you mentioned Alex Atkins not being available. Will Selfridge is also not going to be active, unfortunately. And yet, even without the two bus drivers, so to speak, the two players who were mimicking each other's celebrations back and forth, Selfridge, of course, the originator of the bus driving celebration, and then Atkins kind of mimicking it a few seasons ago in one of their matchups that ended at the buzzer. They'll both be unavailable, so it'll be interesting to see who carries forth the torch on Friday night of just sort of saucing things up. I mean, that's what always happens when these two teams play. And with the kind of young stars that are going to be specifically available on Friday night, I expect similar things. You know, even without Selfridge and Atkins, you've still got Finer, Brooks, as you mentioned, Thoresen, Hawkins, who's been coming on more and more, Noah Kuhlman, who is on pace for a 2020 season, something that hasn't happened since 2021 when an MVP Ben Yat did it. You know, there's just a lot of explosives to talk about on the Summit team, but I agree with all of your points. There's still a lot of question marks. It still took them overtimes in both Seattle and Oregon to come away with wins in week 10, you know, to sort of vanquish the demons of the questions that we have around what they do with away games, you know, given their results, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, earlier in the season in Texas. But, you know, the Summit team undeniably lacks tons of playmakers, and they're going to be able to have a real test at trying to slow something down in this shred attack that's been one of the best all season. And you talk about the sort of, I think, pedigree for the Salt Lake team. They're third in the league in fewest turnovers per game. You know, we were just talking about the Union and how they've been impressively blowing out their opponents in the Central Division, but there's been a fair amount of mistakes. With the Shred team, they're just kind of taking care of business across the board. They run out teams on offense. Chad Jorgensen is one of the most productive players on that side of the disc. And on defense, to your point about these athletic insertions, there's a new Shred defender every single week flying chest high to get blocks. You know, I think there's the established core of Kyle Weinberg and Ben Ashton and Tony Munga, who have played fantastically for the Salt Lake team for a number of years. But we talked about it heading into the season. The Shred were losing a fantastic amount of defensive starters from the past couple of years, and yet they just plug in a whole new rotation and they're off to the races once again. They're on pace for their fourth consecutive 10-win season since coming into existence in 2022. I mean, this Shred team is about as real as it gets in the UFA right now, outside of having a title.
Yeah, they've won more games the last 2.5 years than any other team in the league in the regular season. And it speaks to the Bryce Merrill leadership and the infrastructure that he's built. You know, you talk about the D line and the pieces that they've plugged in. You know, Nate DeMorgan, one of the top college freshmen in the country. Reed Browning, super underrated
Oh,
Boston
he's
Glory
been
defender.
fantastic. I almost had him on my midseason all defense team. He's been just a dynamite stick in the handler lanes, leading transition. I've loved the Browning edition.
Yeah, I mean he's been really good, and you know they. You mentioned a lot of the names that they returned. The Pugh brothers, Kimball and Sam, I think have. I don't want to say been pleasant surprises because I think Bryce Merrill had reasonably high expectations for them, but they've looked like they've been ready for the moment. You know, both against Atlanta in the season opener, and you know this past weekend as well. So yeah, this Salt Lake team is good and tough. They got Luke Jorgensen back this past week, and that they put him on defense, and he was solid. He had not played a lot of defense in his career, but you know they got all three Jorgensens going, so that's fun. And yeah, I mean I'm thinking about like this Colorado team. You know, Tobias Brooks. Yeah, they're probably giving him more touches than anybody and asking him to orchestrate. Like that's what they did in the one game that he played. It's a little strange that the guy that they're building their offense around, from at least from a backfield possession touches standpoint, has only played in one of the team's first 8 games. So I think it's reasonable to not necessarily be skeptical, but like be unsure what it's going to look like. I remember one of the Colorado players saying like, you know, Oakland made it pretty clear that they weren't going to put their top defender on Toby in the backfield. So we just leaned on Tobias. Like, will Brooks have the same success if it's DeMorgan on him or Mounga or someone else that Salt Lake has a lot of different guys that they can throw at him. Like Chad Jorgensen could cross over for key points and take the Tobias matchup. Now, adding Tobias creates matchup issues because then theoretically, Quinn Finer is still really tough to handle. But like the point is, the Summit are still figuring things out. Like Noah Coolman played a lot of defense this past week. I would guess that'll remain the same, particularly with Atkins out. But Coolman is another nice O line cutter to have. But they've gotten a lot of good stuff from Elliot Hawkins. Seth Ferris has played well, and you and I were messaging about this guy. But how about the former DC Breeze handler Jeremy Knopf kind of finally getting a chance to play an O line role with Colorado? Like he was on the
Mm-hmm.
roster last year, but he was injured, didn't play at all. Started this season, mostly playing D, and then all of a sudden he's played the last 3 games on O. 27 for 28, 40 for 41, 18 for 18, just solid, steady possession frisbee. And I know you've been a fan of Knopf for a long time. I just think like he fits in nicely as a guy that doesn't need the disc, but finding a way to impact the game in positive ways with his spacing, with his timing, in the same ways he did for those historic DC Breeze offenses 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, and I just think he can do a lot with not too many touches, which is exactly what the Summit team needs right now. You talk about the reinsertions of Brooks, of Thorison, alongside of Quinn Finer, possibly Coolman. Elliot Hawkins continues to come on. There's just a lot of different people who kind of have to touch the disc in this Colorado offensive system, and so I think Knopf is one of those players who just kind of cleans everything up in such a way and reestablishes timing almost wherever he is on the field in such a way that is so needed for the Summit attack. And I think what it really comes down to with this Friday night matchup, the more and more I think about it, is who can own the deep space, particularly on the defensive side of the disc. Like who can kind of stymie the over the top attacks that both these teams prefer. Both these teams with no hesitation love to huck it. They love to get their one-on-one matchups. They love to kind of just assert themselves and play, that highlight friendly West Coast, West Division style that we've all become accustomed to over the past couple of seasons. And I think it's going to come down to who can really display a defense that takes something away. Because what we've seen, I think, continually in 2025 is these top West Division teams square off, and it's almost a 50-point game by the end of it. Like neither team is really able to control the tempo too much, and it just becomes almost a game of who can outlast each other by the end. And I think when you talk about the top of this West Division, matchup, it'll be interesting to see if one of these defenses can actually shut down the opposing team's deep looks.
Yeah, it's a good question. One other point to make is that last year each of these teams did win on the other's home field. If you remember, the second game of the season for the Summit, Salt Lake goes to Golden and wins 20-15. But then just a couple weeks later, Colorado has the crazy comeback, and I mean Salt Lake was in control of that home game and then blew it. So it's Salt Lake probably should have won that game, but Atkins took over, and man, that was a memorable comeback. And Salt Lake in a lot of ways gave it away too. But I do think both these teams are confident that they can go and win on the other's home field. So, like, if Salt Lake wins in Golden this week, I still think the Summit are going to probably go to Utah the following week with a lot of belief and confidence, thinking that, all right, they'll make the necessary adjustments. And, similarly, if Colorado is able to get the job done at home, well, Salt Lake will be like, well, we're going home, and that's our house next week. And yeah, I mean, to get these two teams first and second in the standings, two big games, like they both know they're going to the playoffs, but being the one seed out west is going to be a really valuable thing because not only are you at home, but you just advance a round and you don't have to deal with a first round game. And, the Oakland Spiders, if they are the 3 seed, are a very dangerous 3 seed. And while Oakland has had some peaks and valleys in terms of their big games at, Colorado, and both games against Salt Lake. Like, neither you nor I will be surprised if the Spiders put it together and play their best game of the season in the playoffs on the road, maybe even back to back weeks. Like, they're eminently capable and crazy talented, and just their O line is a scary O line, and the numbers that Walker Frankenberg is putting up, it's pretty ridiculous. Like, we've seen individuals put up those kind of video game numbers against bad teams, and yes, I know he lost the game, but to get 1,000 yards and 12 scores against a Salt Lake defense in a game that was close and competitive and intense most of the way, like, we're still looking for the exact way to, create the necessary context for these yardage numbers at times too, Adam. Like, that's something that maybe you and I should spend some time in the off season, like, because yards based upon possessions, and like there's games have
Well,
different
let's
paces,
just
and
make it simple.
but
He leads the league in scores per game with 7.7. Number 2, or excuse me, he's second among all players with multiple starts. Number 1 is Alan Laviolette with 8.5. Walker Frankenberg is second with 7.7. Tobias Brooks and Wyatt Kelman both have 8, but they've only started once, so kind of figures that they might come down a little bit. Maybe not for Brooks, but
I think
then
Walker's
Franken
number one in total yards.
He's number 1 in total yards so far this season, but he's second, again, among adjusted players with more than one start, in total yards per game. Calvin Brown is averaging over 700, but Walker Frankenberg is almost averaging near 6. He's averaging 345 receiving yards per game, which is 4th among all players, 3rd if you, again, adjust for multiple games. I mean, he's just an absolute Pac-Man out there at times, right? Like, his speed, his just sense for attack. There was a replay against San Diego from last Saturday where somebody's picking up the disc and Frankenberg just initiates a 60-yard cut without even looking back, just puts his head down and takes off in a dead sprint for the end zone and just looks up for the disc. I mean, he's completely in the zone right now, to add to your point. I mean, the Spiders are scary. The thing I worry about with Oakland is that in their losses, they've sort of just let go of the rope and allowed their opponents to go on these 4, 5, 6 goal runs against them where it's like, hey, are you guys awake? And while I agree with you, this Oakland team is eminently talented, they do have just a little bit of a focus issue at times, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could call it a focus issue. You could talk about how a bunch of their key guys are in their first year playing in the UFA and still getting used to, the 4 quarter game, and the different pace and different style, over the course of a full season. But like all teams, they've had some roster variability mixed in as well. But when they've been on the Evan Magsig, Leo Gordon, Adam Reese, Walker Frankenberg, Saul Waldowski, offensive group has looked really, really, really good. Like, as good as
Oh yeah.
any offense we've seen in the league in history at times. Like, not for months, but for quarters. And, they've shown that they can be that for stretches. So I think you got to take them seriously for sure in the West. But they get the luxury of well, the luxury of sitting in. They would enjoy the luxury more of just sitting back and watching Salt Lake and Colorado if they hadn't lost to those two teams the 3 times they played against them. But you know that the Spiders will be watching this game. You know that they'll be studying it and thinking about, beating both those teams in the playoffs, because it's in their hands. They will have the chance to do it. They may have to do it on the road, but it's also not impossible that they could get a home game if Salt Lake sweeps Colorado the next 2 weeks, and Oakland beats San Diego. Then the Spiders get a home game. Similarly, if Colorado sweeps the Shred and the Shred also lose to Minnesota in a really intriguing interdivisional game the last week of the season, then the Shred might have to go to Oakland. So like the Spiders are in third place now and they're 0-3 against those teams, but it's still not far fetched to think that they could be at home in round one of the playoffs. And Fremont High School, the win there is quirky. They've had a lot of success at home this year, starting with a season opener against the New York Empire all the way back on April 24th. So yeah, this West Division feels as wide open as any of the divisions. Like I think I would not be stunned if any of these three teams are in the playoffs, or in championship weekend, I should say. Whereas, like Boston clearly separated themselves in the East. I still lean Atlanta's way in the South, and Chicago, Minnesota feels a little bit like a toss-up, but it's one of those two teams. Whereas in the West, like I don't want to say it's 33.33% for each of the three teams to make it because the one seed has an advantage, but the third seed in the West has a better chance than the three seed in any other division, in my opinion, going into the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really disagree with you on any of those points. I still feel like there's something in me. Maybe it's again the sort of pedigreed winning. I feel like the Shred hold a slight advantage in the West this season. Summit are still kind of battling some sort of mental demons or focus or whatever to really get over that hump to get back to championship weekend for the first time since 2022. And with Oakland, I still just need to see it. Again, this is a Spiders team that a couple seasons ago was 7-2, staring dead at a playoff spot, and ended up fumbling the postseason entirely. And I still feel like those ghosts are somewhere in the vicinity of this Oakland franchise and their playoff struggles since winning a title in 2015. I just, I trust still a little bit in the teams that have shown postseason success in recent seasons, but that may prove to be folly in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why you lean on the past, but we have also seen teams exercise those demons in pretty exhilarating ways, whether it was the Flyers in 2021 or the wind chill this past year, or what DC did to New York last season in the regular season to get to championship weekend and vanquishing Boston too. So, I mean, I think we should move on to either the East or the South. The East is more about this weekend. The South is more about last weekend, and what's going forward. Where do you want to go from
Let's stick in
here?
the short term and talk about the East, specifically about this Boston and DC matchup coming up on Sunday, July 6th.
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
1 o'clock game in Boston, and it's going to be hot. It's going to be steamy, and like, sure, Boston would love to get this game. Boston needs just one more win to guarantee the one seed. But this game to me is all about DC. And, can the Breeze go on the road, be competitive, and take it to a glory team that has gotten better as the year has gone on. And I said a few weeks back that I thought the Glory were going to come back to the pack. They have proved me wrong. They took care of business in Canada. They walloped Toronto on the Rush's second day of a back to back. And Boston's depth, like if we're talking 30 deep, like Boston's 21 through 30 might be better than any other team's 21 through 30 in the league. And like, why does that matter? Well, because
yeah.
guys miss games. And the guys that they're throwing in there, like the guys that the Glory just have dressed this week, and they're missing, I think, Tyler Chan in this Sunday game. DC's missing Christian Boxley. And look, I mean, DC against New York in their home game on Friday Night Frisbee early in June, they had a bunch of guys like Kobe Loveranis and Michael Wagner and Ben Greenberg that we hadn't really seen much of, and like, oh, these DC depth pieces are pretty good too. So like, DC is another team in the upper echelon in that department in terms of roster depth. But yeah, that's what stood out to me with Boston, and They get Toba DeCrana back, they get Jeff Babbitt back. DC is going to have its hands full, and this is the type of team that DC is going to need to beat if they want to get to championship weekend. So I really look at this from the DC perspective. Like, do the Breeze have the horses to both match up and outrun this Boston team?
Yeah, and DC is going to want to make it into a tactical affair, right? I mean, that's how they won the East Division Championship game in 2024. They just kind of, I think, uh, out executed the Glory in that game. And Boston, on the flip side, is going to want to make this, a physical run out into space, make plays, utilize Orion Cable, let Jeff Babbitt kind of impose himself defensively, let Toba DeCrana be an all-world player as he's shown throughout 2025. It'll be interesting to see who can kind of control the tone throughout this one, because I feel like when the Breeze and the Glory square up, it's such a stylistic clash. You've got DC, who kind of likes to weave around and through spaces, and you like Glory that are just kind of like this semi truck that can smash into stuff and blow it apart.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way to put it. Um, Yeah, I mean, the question right now in the East Division, in my mind, like, clearly it's interesting which of these three teams between DC, Philly, and New York is going to get left out and miss the tournament entirely. But beyond that, the question is, can Philly, DC, or New York give Boston a really tough game in the East Final? Or is it just going to be like, yeah, it was five really tight teams in the East, but they were all inferior to Boston, and the Glory are going to go win that game by six? And I don't know the answer to that. I
I
think
think this Sunday can
Boston
be pretty
certainly has.
telltale.
Yeah, it could. I mean, if Boston wins this game handily, it's demoralizing for DC, not only because it puts a ton of pressure on them and puts them in danger of missing the playoffs entirely, uh, but it also sends a message that Boston may not be beaten at home all season. And frankly, maybe Boston won't be beaten at all this season. Like, we haven't really talked a whole lot about the possibility of teams going undefeated because there's been so much balance and parity among all these contenders that we viewed as potential championship weekend squads. But maybe I mean, if Boston, I'm not going to say it yet, but if Boston wins this game on Sunday, then I think we need to start thinking about, could this Boston team run the table? Now they have their last three games on the road. It's not an easy slate by any means. At Philly, at New York, at DC, they could lose all those games and finish 9-3 or 8-4. But with everything we've seen so far, and there's something to the fact, like, Boston didn't step out of the division at all. So we got Boston at 8-0, we got Chicago at 8-0. Chicago had the one interdivisional game against Atlanta. It was an Atlanta team without Brett Holzmeyer. It was the Hustle's second day of a back-to-back. Sean Cannell hurt his shoulder the day before, and they still won by one in double overtime, or the Union did. Um, I'm just thinking about, like, this Boston team hasn't had that type of interdivisional test yet, just by nature of the schedule. So I think, it's just, I don't know. It's a thought that's been percolating in my mind. I hope Boston plays some interdivisional regular season games next year and test themselves in a different way. But obviously, the East is a gauntlet in itself. So I'm not trying to make the case that Boston has played a shoddy schedule, except for the fact that after Sunday, they'll have played six of their first nine games at home. Their two of the three games they played on the road were against the bottom two in the division. So they still have tough games left, and we're still learning who this Boston team is. But everything we've seen so far makes me think they're better than I thought they were going to be. And, you know, all credit goes to them and Sam Rosenthal and the squad for putting it together, and we'll see if they can keep it rolling.
Yeah. I mean, I've been kind of on Boston's side, with the way in which they've dispatched everything in their way, and just again seeing how their talent forms together. I think the the way that they play to their strengths is as impressive as anything any team has done this season. You know, we talk about the kind of amazing offenses in Atlanta and Oakland and how Minnesota and Chicago have really flexed out defensively. This Boston team, you know, they just don't have weaknesses. There isn't really an in or a way in which you can take advantage of them. You know, if you want to attack them one on one, they're probably the worst team in the league to approach it that way. If you want to try to dispossess them of the disc, they've been top 3 or top 4 in fewest turnovers per game over the last few seasons. Defensively, they're going to be able to generate turnovers because they've got the 2-time reigning MVP squaring up on the D-line rotations in 2025. You know, there's so many ways that they can just kind of inflict pain on opponents. It's difficult to manage the onslaught of, again, just attack points that this Boston team has.
Yeah, but DC's the team, if anyone in the East can right now. DC's got the depth to try and, disrupt some things. So we will see if they can do it. Uh, it's if the Breeze don't win this game, all of a sudden they're still technically at 5-5 ahead of the Empire due to the full point differential of those two matchups. DC winning by 8, New York winning in double overtime by 1. But it looks a little bit more precarious, and the Empire have their final 2 games at home, as we have discussed. Empire have in the midst of a couple weeks off right now before they retake the field next weekend. And every weekend down the stretch, we got good games in the East. And as I wrote a couple weeks ago, I do think 2, 3, 4 is going to come down to Saturday, July 19th, when DC is at Philly and Boston's at New York, and those 2 games start at the exact same time, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
So,
wow.
and that's just going to be, Boston might have everything clinched by then, or they might not. It's really up to DC to prevent them from clinching, because those 2 teams play twice in 6 days, starting on Sunday afternoon in Boston. So yeah, like the Philly Montreal game this past weekend, it's pretty strange. Like, Philly was missing dudes, and they still had a big lead, and Montreal had another miserable start,
And then they
and
rallied
then
back.
Philly tried to give it away in like Philly fashion from years past, but they get a clean hold, score with 7, 8 seconds left, and escape with the 1-goal win and basically end the Royals' playoff dreams at the same time. Um, you know, the fact that Philly's last 2 games have been home against Montreal and then against Pittsburgh, like, it feels like it's been a while since we've seen Philly play one of these top 3 in Boston, DC, or New York. And, they played DC and New York, both super tough, winning at DC, losing to New York by 1. They have not played, well, they got crushed at Boston. They got a rematch a week from Friday. So, yeah, like, I'd like to take this Philly team seriously, but, you know, you never want to totally lean on, like, the transitive property. And yet, you think, like, well, DC beat Montreal by 12. Philly beat Montreal on the second day of a back-to-back by 1. I know Philly was shorthanded, but that's a big disparity there, and says, like, well, maybe this DC team has played at a higher level over the past several weeks than Philly has, and what does that mean for those 2 teams, juxtaposed side by side down the stretch? We will see. But yeah, it's the East Division. It's fun. Every game down the stretch is going to be really interesting.
Yeah. Nate Little had a career game against Montreal this past weekend. He was a big reason why Philly gutted out that win. It was impressive that they did so much down so many starters. Paulo and Scott Heyman, the Grossberg brothers, a lot of their primary attackers across both lines. And yet, with their upcoming schedule and just kind of, again, to your point of sort of having a little bit of lull in terms of the level of competition that they faced the previous few weeks while the rest of the East Division sort of ramping up, it just sort of feels like a similar predicament as we've seen the past couple of seasons with this Phoenix team, and with their final three games being against Boston, DC, and New York. It's hard to see how they're going to avoid another 5-7 finish. But they started the season 3-0 against our odds and our predictions. So if they can gut it out and somehow make it into the East Division playoffs, I think they deserve a little bit of extra shine than, some of these other teams for, I think, flipping a lot coming into 2025. They lost a franchise player in James Pollard coming into the season. And it's just, I think it's been an impressive run for the Phoenix to make themselves relevant as we round into July on the calendar.
Yeah, if 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 someone had told you and I in the preseason that Philly would be 5-4, tied for second place with 3 weeks to go in the season, we would have been like, "How? No way, no chance. What happened?" And the fact that they are in that spot, they were the story of the first month of the season. Can they also be the story of the last month of the season in the same type of positive way? The jury is still out. Um, and yeah, I did want to touch on the South and what happened this past weekend with Austin falling from the ranks of the undefeated. Uh, it's interesting, Adam, because I don't know if I am ready to say like I'm taking the soul in the South, because I still lean towards Atlanta and I still lean towards Carolina against Austin. However, Austin impressed me more than I thought they would. I was impressed by their competitiveness. I was impressed by Mark Henke. My goodness. What a game he had on Saturday night at Carolina. Plus 12, the highest plus minus for any player in any game this season for a guy who hadn't played a whole lot of offense. And it makes you think, like, man, should this guy be on offense more? He's just 21 years old. I think he turns 22 in September. Like, you know, obviously Kyle,
What's
his
his
older
last
brother,
name
has been a
again? How do you
huge
spell
star
that?
in this league. Yeah, I get your point. Their genes track. They are related, and Mark is his confidence is rising, his skill set is just expanding, and he's the real deal. And he's 4 or 5 years away from his prime, so it's a fun story. Uh, and the Flyers, while Alan Laviolette and Jacob Fairfax were mesmerizing, um, being there calling that game, like there's still a strange vibe around Carolina. Like obviously it was not their best squad. They had some guys that were making their UFA debut as well and had only played a game or two here and there. And there's just a different feel. And part of that is the fact that Mike Denardis was sitting in the broadcast booth next to me instead of leading the team on the sidelines. Like there's just a different feel to the Flyers this year, which doesn't mean that their mainstay talent can't get them to where they want to go. But I don't, I don't, I think it's basically like a Carolina at Austin game at the end of the season feels kind of like a toss-up game to me right now. That and before this weekend, I would have leaned Carolina's way more, but Austin impressed me with their playmaking. They were missing Miles Armstrong, but 18-year-old Carson Armstrong looks polished well beyond his years, being just 18. Like there haven't been too many 18-year-olds serving as mainstay offensive handlers for winning teams. And say what you want about the Soul, but they're 7-2. They were tied at halftime against Carolina. The circumstances Friday night were unlike anything I've ever experienced, and to start a game at 11 p.m. Eastern was just nuts. And I think, look, circumstances would have been different. Let's say that Atlanta was they were 7-3 going into that game. Let's say that they were 9-1 going into that game. I think Austin might not have agreed to, yeah, we'll just play a half. Like Austin just wanted to get the game in. There were logistical scenarios to be factored in. But Austin knows that they'll be a very different team, and over the course of 4 quarters against Atlanta. With that said, the hustle met the moment, especially in the second quarter. I remember talking to Tuba Benson Jaja in the preseason specifically about Kenny Taylor, and Kenny was one of those guys for the hustle that Tuba was like, yeah, I got to get more out of that guy. Like he's way better than he's played for me so far, and I thought that was an interesting point for Tuba to make, and was very honest. And the Kenny Taylor that Tuba's been looking for is starting to show up because he was a menace, and he was one of the big reasons that Atlanta won that game going away on Friday night, closing in on midnight. So, yeah, I mean, the hustle have that look. I talked about it a little with Donardis on Saturday night. Like, some teams just have a hunger to them that is different. And Atlanta is that team this year for me, where you factor in the age of so many of their guys, the experience, the tough losses, the undeniable talent, the key additions, like everything we've talked about all year long. And now I just see like an intense focus and desire and understanding of the path ahead of them. And, they're not perfect. They experienced tough losses during the regular season, which, like, kind of deep down, yes, they wanted to win those games, but they also learned a lot from them. And, yeah, I mean, if you're asking me who's my championship favorite right now, I'm not saying Boston or Chicago, Adam. I'm still leaning Atlanta, even though they're second place in the South.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you. I mean, I think given the kind of battles that they faced so far, Atlanta acquits itself as a championship contender. It's just the fact that they've done that for how many seasons in a row and faced playoff heartbreak in 3 of the past 4 years. I just, until I see it, I can't quite believe it with some of these teams, right? Like, going back to that point earlier in the episode, there's just something about the Blue Bloods at this point where you gotta show it to me in these postseasons. We just haven't seen a team shoot up through the ranks and claim a title, right? Like, you gotta kind of go through your lashes, and Atlanta has, but they haven't really dispatched the monkey off their back yet. And until they can do that in the postseason, until they can do that against maybe Austin or Carolina or a San Diego team that's even taken them, to the brink a couple of times, like I just it's to the point we keep coming back to with all these divisions. When it gets right down to it, everything's a little bit more wide open than even it feels. We've got these teams at the top of each of the 4 divisions, and it feels like they have momentum, and yet they've each got their foibles that I think are exploitable in a one-game playoff format.
And there's the reality that, styles make fights, and teams have different levels of confidence against
Yeah.
different opponents. And Atlanta against Carolina is still kind of hairy for the hustle in a way that it's not against certain other teams.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Carolina is
So
still
if
the bigger brother there in the biggest matchups. I mean, Hustle have evened it up in more recent years, but when it comes down to it, Carolina kind of always edges them out in the games that really matter.
Yeah, we'll see what happens in their final regular season meeting, Atlanta, Carolina. That's not this week, but next week, Saturday, July 12th, at Carolina, and that game will tell us a lot. As Cam Brock said to me, and I quoted him in the Tuesday toss, like that will send a message to the league, but more importantly, that will send a message to themselves that they, won 3 out of 4 in the season series, And, you know, if Atlanta wins that game, there's a high likelihood that Carolina misses the playoffs. So this is Atlanta's chance to eliminate Carolina before having to potentially see them with all the marbles on the line, and and possibly in a 2-3 game. Like, as good as this Atlanta's team is, they could be down by 2 in the fourth quarter at home to the Flyers in the 3-2 game, and like be in danger of missing the final 8, which, like we saw that last year with New York. They didn't make the final 8 after winning the championship the previous 2 years, and we're still kind of waiting for them to flip the switch, and they just, they almost did it. They had that game in hand, I thought, against Boston, and then Jeff Babbitt did Jeff Babbitt things, and the Glory won by one in miraculous, incredible fashion. So, yeah, I mean, like, in the same breath, I say I have Atlanta as my championship favorite, and I would not be surprised if they lost at home to Carolina in the first round of the playoffs.
Atlanta, they've got to bring silver tip bullets, garlic, Van Helsing, whatever they need to that regular season finale against the Flyers to make sure that Carolina doesn't get into the postseason. Because I agree with you. We see it with this Flyers team. Alan Laviolette is on fire. He's an NBA Jam character right now. You just give him the disc anywhere near the half field stripe, it's going into the end zone. Their defense is starting to pick it up week by week. They had Drew Swanson kind of fully healthy this past week. He was a difference maker. He got like 3 blocks and 8 minutes of game clock at one point, it felt like. He was just flying around the field. I know you guys were talking about him on the broadcast when Denardis was up in the booth with you. The Flyers defense has not been good for much of the season. They were an absolute sieve when they were enduring their own forced start. So if they can just get a little
Yeah.
bit of attrition on that side of the disc, a little bit of hard nosed mentality. Yeah, I mean, Carolina, again, like we've talked about throughout this episode, them, New York, even DC, if they kind of falter, these are teams that if their opponents have the ability to put them out of the postseason, they've got to take advantage of it in these next couple of weeks, because you do not want to see them get hot at the right time.
Let me ask you one final question before we wrap it up. Can Alan Laviolette be the MVP if the Flyers don't make the playoffs?
I don't believe so. I do feel like the postseason is kind of a qualifier for that kind of award. I think it goes down as one of the best individual seasons ever. I mean, it already is from a throwing perspective. The kind of volatility he shows as a thrower with the precision he's putting up from basically any range on the field. I mean, it's just, there really aren't comparisons. You can look back at a couple of Jordan Kerr seasons, but Alan Laviolette is really, Ryan Osgar's MVP season. There are some, peers to this, but 2025 Laviolette, I mean, this is pure flow state. You were talking about it again, going up to your conversation in the booth with Mike Denardis. He was talking about this new Frisbee. It's like a superpower for Laviolette, right? It comes out of its hand like it's being printed, right? Like it's on delivery every single time, any range, even his 50-50 shots. They're just, it's like cherry picking for Fairfax underneath or whoever the receiver is. It feels like he's got the touch. But all that said, it'll be a nice statistical season looking on the outside end of the playoffs if they can't take care of business. I do think that disqualifies him from MVP discussion, because again, you look on the flip side, I mean, there's plenty of other players having fantastic seasons. Austin Taylor is also having a historic season for the Atlanta Hustle. You got Donda Murray and Toba Decrana, the 2 international stars for the undefeated teams in Chicago and Boston, respectively. I mean, there's a lot of players, I think, similarly to like we have a lot of candidates for a championship trophy. I think the MVP discussion is going to be wide open as we head into this home stretch of the schedule.
Yeah, and the other point on that is maybe this will change in the future. And in other professional sports, the NBA is a regular season award, but we have made historically the playoffs a part of our MVP considerations. So I would agree with you that if the Flyers don't make the playoffs, it'd be really tough to not kind of have that postseason closing statement. Uh, if you're Laviolette. Um, I just pulled up that Ryan Oscar MVP season because like that's kind of what Allen has reminded me of in certain ways. And just to remind you, 3 years ago in 2022, Oscar played 12 games. He had 67 assists in the regular season, 26 goals, 97.5%. In the regular season 3 years ago, Oscar was 21 for 22 on his Hucks, which I had forgotten. Like 21 for 22, it's pretty ridiculous. Now Laviolette
It was
has
the
more Huck
2023
completions.
Empire. I mean, that's the greatest team ever, right?
22, 20, well 22, but you might the point still stands.
Pick a
Uh,
season.
but yeah, I mean Laviolette was 6 for 6 on his Hucks this past Saturday. He's 26 for 32, I believe, on the season. Uh, no, 26 for 30. Yeah, he's 26 for 30 on the season. 86.7% on 30 Hucks. And that's that's better than I like would expect even the best throwers to do considering the defenders in this league and just the way the frisbee can fly in unpredictable ways. Like, yeah, Laviolette has this new disc down, and
Well, and again,
he made it look easy.
he's got a Jacob Fairfax on the other side there too. That'll up a Huck number for almost any thrower. I feel like.
It's true.
When
It's
are we
true.
gonna
So
get the?
Fairfax for MVP.
You can't dissuade me from him. I've always had a number 20 crush. So I don't know, man. He's a machine downfield as a receiver. But that'll probably wrap
He
it for
sure
this
is.
episode of Swing Pass. We are just 2 days away from the 4th of July holiday, and you've got to remember Frisbee on the 4th. We've got a fantastic lineup of 3 games. Starting off with Friday night Frisbee at 5 p.m. Eastern, the Central Division clash between the undefeated Chicago Union hosting the reigning champion Minnesota Wind Chill in what figures to be one of the best matchups of the entire regular season. Then at 7 p.m. Eastern, Toronto at Montreal, a feud that goes back almost a decade at this point. Actually, a decade. It's the 11-year anniversary of their long-standing Canadian duel. And then in the evening at 9 p.m. Eastern is the start of the game of the week. And that'll be the first meeting between the 2 top teams in the West. Salt Lake at Colorado. Final 2 games that I mentioned will be available on Watch UFA TV Friday night. Frisbee again will be available on YouTube. That'll do it for Evan and I on this episode of Swing Pass, but we will be announcing and watching alongside you all of the Week 11 action. We will say bye for now, but as always, remember, Frisbee forever.